The story of Pakistan is told by outsiders, by foreigners,
Yeah.
by foreign correspondents who don't know anything about Pakistan. I mean, you're Pakistani, I'm Pakistani. We're still trying to understand Pakistan. So, how can someone come from England or America who doesn't live here, doesn't speak the language, doesn't know all the codes, doesn't know how people live, behind closed doors? How can he tell us anything about that place?
In today's episode, we are joined by Fatima Bhutto to talk about South Asian representation in fiction and film and how we need to write our own stories.
What's really exciting is that actually Pakistanis are now beginning to create their own space to tell those stories, whether in film, whether like what you're doing here, whether through books or articles. And that's not only going to change how people see Pakistan, but it's also going to change how we see Pakistan.
This is the first half of our conversation with Fatima Bhutto. Welcome to another episode of Out of the Box. Assalamu alaikum everyone. Welcome to another episode of Out of the Box. In today's episode, we have a very special guest with us. She was born in Kabul, raised in Damascus and Karachi. Fatima Bhutto is a writer. She published her first book, a collection of poetry called Whispers of the Desert, when she was just 15. She is someone who talks about violence in politics. She talks about women's leadership. She talks about freedom of press. She talks about the relationship that is cultivated between politics and culture. And there's a lot more, and we will dive into that in today's episode. First of all, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here with us. It is a delight, and I cannot wait to get into this conversation.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. So, first of all, how has it been being here in Pakistan? How was it like your trip? How did it go?
Well, it's always wonderful to be back home, and home is a place that never leaves you. So I guess you carry it with you wherever you are. But to physically be at home is always a beautiful feeling, actually.
That's very true. That's true. So let's just start off with something simple. How did you figure out that writing was something that you definitely wanted to see yourself doing for a really long time, and that would inevitably become a career choice for you?
I suppose it started very young because when I was small, my father introduced me to a library. I remember the first time he took me to a library, I must have been in kindergarten. And he made such a ceremony over the library. It was as though you were going somewhere holy, somewhere sacred. And I remember the way he treated the outing. It really made me think that I was entering this incredible new world. And he passed on this love of books. And I suppose it started there. I loved reading, I loved books, I loved stories. And then as soon as I could, I started to write them. And again, my father was very encouraging and always read my stories very seriously. Even if I had written, a paragraph, he would spend time looking at it. He'd ask me what I thought about when I was writing it. And I was really in the sixth grade before I guess it occurred to me that I could or might want to be a writer, because we had a project for our English class to compile a book of poems. And I did the same thing everyone else in my class did. But when I showed my father my collection of poems, he was like, you should publish these. And I was like 11 years old. So I was like, really? And he's like, yes, you have to keep writing. Don't stop with the project. So I kept writing. And that was actually what became Whispers of the Desert, which I published in his memory after he was killed.
It's very encouraging when you are raised by parents who push you,
Yeah.
right? That's and I think for me personally, I'm fortunate enough to have those friends who are always pushing me. Since you're so good at painting, why don't you, talk to people and make this a thing? I'm like, I'm not. I just do it for fun. This is something I do it for fun, but they're like, no.
I think that if you have someone in your life who, when you tell them about something that you love doing and you're passionate about, says you shouldn't do it, you should move away from that person, actually, because young people, children, teenagers need encouragement. And without it, I think the damage is enormous.
Yeah, that's true. Since we're on the topic of books and writing, why is it that we have such a poor representation of what it really is like to live in Pakistan or India or Bangladesh, I mean South Asian representation? Why is it that every time you pick up a book or you watch a movie, most of them, why is it that you can't seem to recognize the very country you've lived in since forever?
That's an excellent question. And it's a very simple reason. It's because we are not telling our stories. It's because the story of Pakistan is told by outsiders, by foreigners,
Yeah.
by foreign correspondents who don't know anything about Pakistan. I mean, you're Pakistani, I'm Pakistani. We're still trying to understand Pakistan. So, how can someone come from England or America who doesn't live here, doesn't speak the language, doesn't know all the codes, doesn't know how people live, behind closed doors? How can he tell us anything about that place? And I think that this is a huge disservice that's been done. Um, I'm part of this mentorship, which I'm glad we are able to talk about, called South Asia Speaks. And what we're trying to do is to get early career writers from India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Nepal, from all over South Asia, and to try and give them the opportunities to work with established writers because they don't have the connections. They don't live in a place where they can pass by a publishing house or where they can get an agent or where they can pitch things to magazines. And so we're trying to make up for that and bypass the gatekeepers. Because I really don't want to read a book about Pakistan that's written by a non-Pakistani. I really don't. It's pretty banal and it's pretty boring and they don't really know what they're talking about. So we have to stop running out and buying those kind of books. We have to start asking for books written by Pakistanis. And that book can be about anything and it's going to be richer than the guy who's come from Harvard or the BBC or whatever.
Yeah. Oftentimes, I feel like some of the writers are just pandering to what the Western observers or the audience wants to see, and they're just pandering to that.
Yeah, and again, I think that's partly because if you're a writer, and this is maybe what people don't talk about, and you approach a magazine or an international outlet, they will tell you like, oh no, we don't want to know that, but like tell us about violence or like tell us about terrorism. And so it's also our job to say, well, there's so many other things actually that you might want to look at and no one's talking about them. I mean, you have to make them want that story.
Yes.
But those are the interesting stories, and I think what's really exciting is that actually Pakistanis are now beginning to create their own space to tell those stories, whether in film, whether like what you're doing here, whether through books or articles. And that's not only going to change how people see Pakistan, but it's also going to change how we see Pakistan. It's going to make us create a different imagination. And countries need imaginations to grow and to transform in order to thrive.
I think for me personally, imagination was like a very important part of me growing up, especially since I was the sort of kid who'd always keep to herself. So I curated a world of my own.
Yeah, it's essential to survive.
Yeah.
What does it mean to be Pakistani? Well, it means something new every day, every month, and every year. And we need the freedom to explore those avenues. Otherwise, I don't know what happens. You atrophy. You just have a singular version that maybe doesn't align with your perspective or how you've lived. And it's isolating, it's alienating. And I think we're a diverse enough place that we don't need to alienate anyone. We have space for everyone's version of Pakistan or everyone's imagination of Pakistan.
That's true. Initially, when I asked you that question, you talked about how we ourselves are still trying to figure out what it feels like to really be a true Pakistani, or just like to live here, to live the experience of being a Pakistani. So I was just reminded of how I do talk about it a lot here, how growing up, I always felt displaced and I almost had an identity crisis when I moved here the second time because I couldn't figure out, it's like I was born in Peshawar. I was raised here for a couple of years. Then I come here, then Islamabad, then back here. It's like, where do I truly belong? What are my roots? How do I connect with home? Is this home to me? Was that home? What really is the concept of home, right? So that is what I was reminded of.
Yeah, I think, I think the truth is we belong everywhere, and no one has the right to tell someone where they belong. And today you belong here, tomorrow you might belong somewhere else. I think home is really in your... Yeah, I struggled with this a lot because I used to wonder what's home and where's home. And when you're a kid and adults tell you like home is like you carry home with you, it's here. I used to think, "Wow, what does that even mean?" But it's true now that now that I'm much older.
It makes
I
sense.
think it makes sense. I think, we all feel a bit rootless. And the truth is, wherever you sit down, you put roots.
Yeah, that's true. So, since we're on the topic of Pakistan, one of our correspondents, she made a film and she talked about how the post flood situation in Rahim Yar Khan district, and this is like one of the many places which have been badly affected. And she talked about how there was menstrual and maternal relief required there, and homes have been destroyed. Men have issues when it comes to labor, and then of course the roads have been completely destroyed. Do you still feel like it's very important for us even right now to talk about the post flood situation?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things that we have to start urgently recognizing is that Pakistan is on the forefront of climate, the climate disaster idea. We're going to be one of the first victims. And we are negligible in the crime against climate. We don't contribute to climate the way large countries do, the way industrial Western countries do, but we're paying the first price. And so Pakistan is a cipher for the world. What happens in Pakistan today is going to happen in America in 5 years, it's going to happen in Belgium in 5 years, it's going to happen in Sweden, whatever you want to look at. We're the first point of contact. And so for people not to care about Pakistan and the flood situation is a criminal act. And I mean, it's criminal for us, it's criminal for outsiders. If you even think of your own childhood, I remember growing up in Karachi and the floods being mildly inconvenient to becoming troubling, to becoming disastrous, to becoming dangerous, and now to becoming an existential issue. When, 80% of your crops are damaged, that's not a inconvenience. That's an existential problem. It means people don't eat. It means they starve. It means the economy suffers. So, whether we're talking about how the flood has affected the agricultural sector, we're talking about how it's affected people's homes, nobody is left out of that. Hundreds of thousands of livestock um, were just swept away in the floods. You might say, I don't care about animals. Well, you should. That's someone's livelihood. That's someone had taken out debt to have those animals, and now they're gone. It means his family can't eat. It means, what do they do? How do we survive in a world without wildlife? We can't. We'll die next. If one says, oh, well, I don't care about this province or that province, well, it's coming for you too. So the flood situation is a global problem. It's not just a Pakistani problem. And it means several things. It means we have to think not only about disaster preparedness, and in Sindh, when we talk about corruption, what does corruption mean? It means not just that someone gets rich off the suffering and expense of another person, but it means in the moment of a disaster, people are on their own. They have no state. There's no disaster preparedness plan. There's no water infrastructure plan. There's no sewage. There's no medical relief. There's no nothing. So what did we see during the floods last year? We saw that people were looking out for each other, that people went to places they knew and brought relief with them. And what we also saw is that people don't trust the government. They just don't. So when the government comes, it comes with a string attached, it comes with a photo opportunity, it comes with something. The government is the one diverting water so that their MPs' lands don't get flooded, but their enemies do. And while that's tragic and criminal, in the case of Sindh, what we also saw is that people looked out for each other, is that people knew that even if I haven't personally been affected, or I've been mildly affected, I live in this community and I have a responsibility to others. Pakistan has the second largest population of glaciers after the Arctic regions. And because of climate change, they're melting. That's why we had the super flood, because the monsoon and the glacial melt combined. So climate change is not something that happens somewhere else. We have to think about how we live. We have to think about not only how we live, because our responsibility, yours and mine, I mean, as people, is negligible, right? But corporations are the reason that global heating is happening at the escalated rate it is. So you and I can recycle, we should. You and I can be careful how we use transport, we can do all those things. But the point of the big companies, and the big companies have to be, Well, they have to be, I mean, I don't want to say attacked, but they have to be held accountable. They have to be held accountable, and we don't have time to do it nicely. You know, one has to be really, yeah, attacked's the wrong word, but kind of. They have to be told, we know what you're doing to the earth. We know you're responsible. Your attempted greenwashing doesn't work. We want change from you. So I interviewed Noam Chomsky 2 years ago when he had a book out on climate justice and Green New Deals globally. And I asked him, what do you do with corporations? And I liked his suggestion. He said CEOs of corporations should be jailed if they don't reduce emissions. And I thought, wow, that's wonderful. Yeah, they should. You know, it means you don't use their products. It means you name and shame them in your community. It means you ask for something to be done. You don't just say like, oh, climate change is bad. It's so. It means you say, what are you going to do? Because we have genuinely no time left. No time. So we either address this or we suffer. And it won't just be Pakistan that suffers, it'll be the whole world.
You really summed it up nicely, yeah. Chomsky is like that. He's amongst those very few honest people. He doesn't beat around the bush.
Yeah.
He just says whatever's on his mind and how he truly feels about a project or any.
Well, he's not compromised, so he doesn't need anything from, you know, Shell or Saudi Aramco, or you can't buy him out, really. So he says what he thinks, and I think that's the point, you know, that we have to find solutions. So we have to ask governments also to come up with Green New Deals. We have to demand things of our government. You know, it's not enough to complain about them. I think you have to ask them for questions. And you have to get answers from them. If I can segue slightly, I mean, my brother and I, Zulfikar and I, were in Sindh just recently, and Sindh has a huge problem of ghost schools. And ghost schools are called ghost schools because the government takes money from, let's say, I don't know, the UN or Denmark or whatever, to enhance education, in this case in Sindh. And they build a school so that they can take a picture and they can cut a ribbon and they can send the picture to whoever, Denmark or Sweden or the UN, and say, here, thank you so much for donating to education in Pakistan. But they'll never populate that school with students. So the school is built. On paper, 400 schools were built. But in practice, those schools are empty. That's why they call them ghost schools. So Sindh has hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of ghost schools. And there's another thing that happens, which is even more sinister, is that in Pakistan, on election day, anyone contesting, like any party contesting, can have one of their agents in a polling booth to ensure that there's no rigging, okay? Obviously, that agent, if you, Sarosh, have a political party, the Sarosh agent can be there. And if I have one, then the Fatima agent can be there, right? They're not neutral, right? Your guy's working for you, my guy's working for me. In Pakistan, the neutral observer in any election booth is a government school teacher, okay? They are technically the neutral observers who don't work for anyone and who are supposed to supervise the fair running of an election. But government school teachers are hired by whatever government is in charge in that province. So what happens in Sindh is that when the government comes in, they hire 4,000, let's say, school teachers. They're not teachers. They're not qualified. They're their supporters, okay? On election day, they're going to make sure they win. And what that means is that in those ghost schools, so let's say we've got a ghost school here, on the books, 20 people are employed in that school, and they're taking government salaries. They're going to take a government pension, and they're never going to teach a child. The thing you have to say is, I not only demand an answer, but I have a right to an answer, and I want it now. They have to give it to you. They have to give it to you. And that's what we have to start. We have to start thinking proactively. It's not enough just to whinge and whine and say boo-hoo and all that. Ask for answers.
I'm glad you brought this event up because I was going to ask you about safeguarding children's rights, as basic as their education or the right to provide them shelter, nutrition. So I feel like we're quite far away from doing that because I remember you once tweeted about this 11-year-old boy who was jailed for stealing iron from the trash. And I'm sure this is one of many events where children, the authorities are not held accountable for treating children the way they're treated, be it when it comes to their education, be it in other sectors as well.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's the same kind of problem. It's that who is checking up on child health care? Who is making sure that children who don't have resources can have the same access as everyone else? Who's checking on schools? And the children who are being denied can't do that checking. It has to be us. So if you're privileged in Pakistan, which many people are, if you have that privilege, then you also have a duty, you have a responsibility. And I think you can pick literally anything. You could pick healthcare, women's healthcare, children's healthcare, education, but pick something, because ignoring it or neglecting it just because it doesn't affect you is a disservice. Another thing that I always tell people is that if you think of, again, elections, who's left out? Like, women are left out because to vote in Pakistan is not a right. It's a luxury. It's a luxury because a Shanakhti card is not given to you. You pay for it. You have to buy it, essentially, right? It's not that you turn 18 and you get a Shanakhti card. You go to the Nadra office. Maybe in where you live, there is no Nadra office, right? So maybe you have to travel a long distance to go to the Nadra office. You do the thumbprint, the picture, whatever. And then you have to go home, and then you have to come back. So already it costs you. Already this is not a free enterprise. It doesn't arrive at your doorstep. And then when it's ready, you've got to go and pay. It's maybe not a big amount, but it's still an amount. And, whether that's big or little depends on where you are. And so one of the things that's really easy to do is that, if you're a woman, the women who work in your home, the women who work in your school, the women who work in your office, the women who work in the salon you go to, ask them if they have Shanakhti cards. They probably don't. And they might tell you, well, I don't want one because I don't want to vote. Or like, I don't trust the system. Or like, obviously you have to vote because if you're not using your vote, someone else is. So even if you go and you just stamp a smiley face on the ballot, you should use it. So they might say like, well, I don't care about voting. And then you have to try another tack, which is, well, what about money? Don't you want a bank account? And they might say, well, my father's really lovely to me and he gives me what I need. Or my husband is wonderful. Okay, well, you need a Shanakhti card for a SIM card. And that's where usually they'll go, oh. Yes. And they'll say, well, my father gave me one. And you say, well, what happens when your father dies? What happened if you marry someone who's cruel to you and he takes it away? You can't get one. And it takes, it's very little effort to gather 5 women, put them in a car or a rickshaw or a Kareem or whatever, and take them to Nadra and do the process for them. It costs very little time. If you're privileged, it costs you very little money to do. And I think that's a big difference. So we have to start not just saying there's a problem with children's education or there's a problem with women's rights. We have to find these little ways in which we can make differences. And there's many.
We will be continuing our conversation with Fatima Bhutto next week. Till then, do not forget to like, subscribe, share it with your friends and family, and leave a comment down below.